Someone once told me if they see you in 5 places, they think you're everywhere. And that really stuck with me. And so the process that we took early on was
this might be the most valuable podcast you listen to this year. My guest today is Joe Nash, a man with a crazy resume, but his most recent gig was at Buck, where he served as Director of Business Strategy. And now he's an advisor and consultant for studios, helping them learn how to build relationships, maintain them, and get work, aka business development. He also runs the Brand Trackers newsletter, which covers marketing and advertising technology trends, branding, and more. He's a busy guy, but he took time to chat with me about exactly how he approaches and teaches others to get business. And some of his advice isn't so obvious. We talk about how he builds relationships, does research, and connects the dots for his clients so that it's almost inevitable that they think of you for that project they're about to do. We also talk about the economic downturn, the future of advertising and media, and what artists and studios should be thinking about as far as big opportunities that are bubbling up and aren't yet being serviced well. It turns out there are actually some major opportunities out there, so make sure you listen until the end to learn about those. All right, that's enough setup. Let's meet Joe. I feel like this has been a long time coming. I mean, we've known each other for several months now. We were introduced by a mutual friend, Joe Donaldson. And the second I met you, I was like, I know I'm going to have him on the podcast one of these days. So that day is today. Thank you for doing this, man.
You have the exclusive. This is actually, I don't know if you know this is the first podcast I've ever done and spoken publicly outside of like my silly LinkedIn videos. So I'm very excited. Yeah.
That's really, it's kind of hard for me to believe because like you have a nice camera, you've got a nice microphone, like you're put together, you like, combed your hair for this. So you seem like you know what you're doing. You're natural. It's funny when you fall into these roles at studios where you're in the work, you're kind of in the weeds. And so you're less sort of out there publicly speaking, but now sort of in, where we are in 2023, it is fun to have these conversations a bit more publicly. And I think there's a lot of topics for us to talk about. Yeah. Well, let's get right into it. So, it's funny because before I met you, I'd actually heard your name. And I think it was just because you've kind of been around the industry for a while. Working at various studios, and you've been in leadership roles for the latter part of your career. So maybe you could just start by sort of introducing yourself to the audience and telling them your origin story, as much detail as you want, that led you to end up on the School of Motion podcast today.
Cool. I think like many, or maybe not like many, but I want to distill this idea, but a very non-linear career. And so I grew up being obsessed with what we all do, right? Design, motion, storytelling. I actually started in live action. I was a PA on you might not even know this, second unit, B unit for Sopranos. Spent a number of years in live action, getting up at 4 a.m. and doing that. But I do not like waking up at 4 a.m. and traveling and having 18-hour days. I actually fell in love with design and animation in probably like early aughts, I'll give a shout out. I've talked about this for years, but I've never reached out to them. But there's a husband-wife duo in Portland called Impactist. And they had this incredible film that I saw when I was in school, and it changed my life. It was literally like a 5-second moment that was like, design, motion, animation. I was obsessed. I spent the first half of my career on what I'll call the classic broadcast, motion graphics world that I think a lot of us maybe got our start in. I eventually started a company called State Design with Marcel. I was there for the first 2 years to really help establish it. But, all the success the last 8 or 10 years is totally Marcel and the amazing team he's had around him. I actually took a few years off, and my wife and we started a small farm and cafe because we got a little burned out, like you do. Story for another podcast, let's say. And then from there, I went to move sort of more into business development roles, although I am very much a producer's producer is how I describe myself. I'm not like a salesperson. So I spent some time at Trollback doing client partnerships for them. I spent a few years at a company called Carbon Visual Effects, which is part of White House Post. That was a lot of training for what I'll call like hardcore advertising, live action, what that pipeline looks like. And then I spent the last almost 4 years at Buck in the New York office, helping grow that office, as well as some services and offerings. And I am now independently consulting, working with all my friends. And it's been a dream this past year. Yeah.
That's great, man. Well, thank you you condensed that really, really well. I think probably what most people listening to this are gonna, want us to talk about is your experience doing the business development part of it. And, especially this year, and we're gonna talk a lot about the economy, I think, in this podcast. But this year, it's just been harder than ever for everybody to get work. Everyone from, the lone wolf freelancer to big studios like Buck. So maybe you could kind of define business development. Like, what does that mean? I have one idea. I'm sure everyone who's listening has some idea, but what actually is it in your mind?
It's funny because I for a long time, I wanted to say business development is dead, but it's actually sales is dead to me, right? This idea of selling what we do is really not the process, right? We don't sell widgets. We're not selling software. We don't ask people to buy mufflers. And I really struggled with what business development meant to myself, because I always thought business development was sending emails. It was like, oh, that's what you do, right? To get work, you send a bunch of emails and it's a numbers game. And hopefully if you send 500 emails, 3 people respond. But when you start to work for larger companies and the stakes get higher, what you realize is that it is nothing of that. I failed for 10 to 15 years learning what business development is not. And it is really this idea of it's relationships. Everything that we do is relationships and trust. And I think we often sometimes think that we're in the creative business, but I say we're actually in the people business. There is not a right way to design an ad, and there is not a right way to create a piece of content. And so what we often do are bringing groups of people together to solve a business challenge that exists. And it is that collection of humans who we think are the right folks to solve that problem, to tell that story, to hopefully create some sort of, this is what we're trying to achieve with that. And so what you realize is actually about bringing folks together, the right group of folks to solve the right problem. And that's really what I think business development is: building relationships. It's being curious, understanding what actually matters to these clients. And when you're a good human and you actually care about helping them, you are not a transactional partner. You're actually helping them, make progress, which is really what our goal is.
Got it. Okay. So, when I started my career, I didn't know the word business development, but I did know about sales. And, I'd seen movies where people were just cold calling and, boiler room and things like that. But then the first company I ever worked for was this little production company. It's actually much bigger now in Boston, called Element. And they hired this, I think her title was producer, but actually she was hired to do business development. I realize that now. I didn't realize that at the time. And she was this young woman that had worked at a bunch of the ad agencies. She'd come from New York, and that carries cachet in Boston. And I watched her work, and we became friends. And all I really saw her do was be cool to hang out with. That was kind of her thing. And she would, she knew all these agency people, and that was mostly where our work was coming from. And she would just make friends with everybody and bring people out to lunch and go to parties and be fun to hang out with. And then when they had a job, they would think of her, which then the job would come to us. And it kind of blew my mind that that's a job. So is that kind of what you're talking about? Business development is being the popular person that everyone likes and work comes to you for that?
I think that's what we think the job is. And I think that's what happens. I think what happens is a lot of companies hire personable humans to act as business development. But business development is simply the verb and the action. And so what I have realized the last 2 years, I kind of call it the, 3 Bs, 3 pillars of growth. But it was this idea of business intelligence, right? Having some sort of research data, understanding how your business operates, where you actually make your money, right? Understanding who you are as a company. But it's also really important to understand what are the actual needs of our clients. And then how do we actually track demand? Because I think that's what a lot of what we're going to get into later on, which is needs are shifting. And what we all did 5 years ago is not what we do today. And I think that's what we're all stuck on, which is where do we go next, right? We've seen work dry up. We've seen things slow down. But I actually don't think the needs have slowed down. They've just changed. They're going to different places and the needs are evolving. And so when you actually think about business intelligence and how you can use data and information to inform that, you then have to go to business strategy, right? You have to think about, well, how do we work with, these great brands that we want to work with? Because the business is based on relationships and trust. If you're a studio and you want to go and work with some exciting brand, that person, that creative director, that producer, which to be honest, those titles might not even be the right titles anymore. They have friends that they've worked with for 20 years. And so behavior change is hard, right? Getting people to sort of, we call it anxiety of the new, right? When you open up Netflix and you've got all these choices, it's like, oh, what do I pick? It's kind of the same thing when a new person comes into your life and they're offering this creative service, because you already have convenience. You already have trust with the people that you work with. So how do you make someone take a risk and a chance to work with you? And that is where strategy comes in. That's really thinking about what matters to clients. And, we don't have to get into it today, but it is this process of defining what is the actual job to be done for this person, because it's not just about creativity. It's a number of other reasons. And then understanding, we call it needs, barriers, and triggers, but like, what do they actually need? What are the reasons that they're not choosing us, or what is the barrier that they have to get something to accomplish? And then finally, the trigger is the essentially nothing is random, right? No job is ever random. Brands are incredibly seasonal and things happen at a certain time for a certain reason. So when you start to map all this out, you start to realize there's a rhyme and a reason to everything. And that's what strategy is. It's actually thinking through, I think we sell how we want to sell, right? Oh, I'm going to send 200 emails and I'm imposing the way I want to sell on you. But we don't think about how our clients want to buy or where they are in the process. And so when you really understand that sort of that timeline, when things happen, why they choose, you can sort of like decipher and break it down. So then business development, I say, is kind of like the easy part. When you do that homework, it's just then bringing it to life. It's then in going and being a curious human. I would say like I'm a pretty outgoing, chatty person, but like I am obsessed with brand. Like I grew up on the brand side of things. So although I kind of started talking about business development publicly recently, the things that most people know me about is someone who's obsessed with marketing, brand, creativity. They don't think of me as a biz dev person because no one wants to hear from a salesperson, right? No one wants to hear from someone whose title is business development because they just know you're being sold to. So the best salespeople, they hide in plain sight, right? We are only there to help our clients make progress. And when you start to sort of shift your mentality, that's when you go from just, transactional projects to actual real partnerships.
Interesting. Okay. So I want to come back to this and dive into that concept and get really specific too, because there's a lot there. And, like the way you just laid it out, I think that is kind of a different way of looking at business development than most people who haven't done it think, right? I think most people assume it's more of a sales thing. And you're talking about relationship building, and I'm glad you brought up trust, because I think that's a big barrier to get new work sometimes. It's just, they got to take a risk on you. They've never worked with you. It's a budget that they only get to spend once. And, if they pick the wrong person, their ass is on the line. But before we get to that, I think it might be helpful to look at this through the lens of, the last big studio you were at, which was Buck. And I'm curious, like everyone who listens to this podcast knows, like, I worship Buck just the same as everybody else in this industry. They've been the big dogs forever and they still do incredible work all these years later. What in your opinion enables that? They have amazing talent at Buck, right? But there's lots of studios that have amazing talent that aren't the size and don't have the influence and frankly, the treasury, the coffers of Buck. So what is it there that enabled that, you think?
It is a tough use case because, Buck is a very unique place and they've been around for a long time. And it's all true. It's an amazing place to work. You do your best work there. Everyone has imposter syndrome. But a conversation with someone recently is Buck is still kind of no different than anyone else. And I say in the sense of wanting to normalize and not think that everyone has things figured out. Buck's success, though, like Buck does not have thousands of clients, but they have deep partnerships and relationships with companies that they have built over decades. And it's kind of like when we talk about artists where it's like the 10,000 hour thing. It is a lot of core relationships across a variety of brands and teams and industries that has allowed for Buck to grow in terms of those partnerships with clients. I think the other side of that is there is this sort of special sauce that Buck has always doubled down on in terms of talent. It is this sort of, what do we call it? The Buck Massive, this like magic nucleus of humans that come together and just make incredible work. But it's also right sizing to clients' needs as well, and being able to scale in certain ways. But I think the story is relationships. I always say relationships matter. And that is a lot of what I learned at Buck was that a lot of those core relationships with the big tech companies were through, relationships that Orion and Ryan built 15 years ago and just continuing to beat those, keep those strong over time. My personal point of view, and very much lived this at Buck because I spent the first 2 years as executive producer of New York, and then I moved to director of business strategy. But it's this idea of like, I wanted people to come and work with us, and the craft is great. But again, it's not always about the craft, because you said something before, which is really important, which we work with, often creative directors at brands or agencies or whatever it is. But who are their reports, right? Who do they talk to and what matters to them? And you start to think a little bit beyond just the sort of narrow scope of the problem that we are solving for our one client. Like I always say, one client actually equals 3 clients, right? You've got your direct point of contact, who's your CD at the brand you're working with, but who's their boss, right? What matters to them, right? You got to be able to speak to their needs as well, because, if that job goes wrong, if that first job goes wrong, they never call back. And the lifetime value of a client can often be very high. So you've got your one client, which is your point of contact. You've got your second, which is often their stakeholder. And then the third client is the brand, right? Like, how do you actually impact the brand and help them? And when you start to think beyond just the deliverable and just who you're directly working with, you start to create an experience where they say, oh, working with them was so great. They really understood what mattered to us. They really understood what was important to have done. And they said, well, we have to go back, right? The work is great. The experience, they really took care of us, because as much as we have to learn the language of our clients, we have to teach them our language as well. We have to bring them along for the journey, because they might not know what an animatic is. They might not understand how to respond to storyboards. And so it is this, I don't think any company should ever position themselves on that experience, but it is all these little things that add up, right? It's a bunch of small decisions that lead to a larger decision, which ends up being, decade-long partnerships.
Right. Yeah, that concept of lifetime value is really interesting. And, if you can get one job from Google, right, some low-level thing, but you kill it, and then you can maintain that relationship with that creative director, whoever, booked you. And then, over 10, 15 years, they're rising through the ranks and their budgets are growing and they keep coming back to you, and that helps you grow. I mean, is that kind of it? Is it just sort of like you have to play the long game and you have to just, hit home runs every time?
I think you have to identify where that, lifetime value exists. I think it's fair to say this. We had a lot of brands that we had done some one-off projects with, but when we got that first job, it was never the big, juicy, huge budget. It was usually something small and,
a test.
There was not built trust yet. And so I obsess over the first project. It is one of my, that first project is going to determine, again, what could be many years of work. And so making that first job a really unique experience, a special experience, not to do it at a lower margin or sort of do anything that is bad for the job or bad for you financially, but that a lot of what I talk about is growth and strategy and how you go to move into new areas. But where real growth happens, where real partnerships happen, is active project management, right? It's why I say I'm a producer's producer, because yes, I have a framework and a process and a way to think about this stuff. But like it was our ability to actually like care about what our client, actually be willing to ask questions, to be really curious, and to be honest when you don't understand things, because you have to, like, what we talked a second ago about what we did 5 years ago is not what we do today. It's not going to be what we do in 5 years. The marketing organizations have changed drastically over the last 5 years, right? Like the term product-led growth or demand generation, performance marketing, like we were doing explainer films and broadcast packages 10 years ago. Like we didn't have to ever think about this
the ROI that our product, exactly.
Or the changing, evolving nature of these internal teams, right? A lot of the times we work with creative directors who their direct report is not marketing, it's product, right? And they work with people in product. So what is the language they have to speak to their folks? And so it is being curious. It is really, once you get that job, like if you don't know something, ask. Right? Because I think if you are honest and you are curious, people appreciate that and they want to help because they want their job to go well as well.
So, okay, let's start to get a little tactical here. And maybe you can kind of walk us through what this would actually look like. So let's say that, there's a small studio or maybe a medium-sized studio. They would love to get a, $250,000, $300,000 job from Spotify as an example. Okay, so they hire you to consult. What would that look like? How long would it take to even have a shot at getting something, like that?
I kind of say, when it comes to building these relationships, it might take 6 to 12 to 18 months. And if that is not, fast enough for you, then like, I am not your person. But the reason I say that is trust is built over time. Trust is not implied and is not given. And when you start to work with a Spotify, everyone at Spotify has friends they've worked with for a very long time. And so in the same way that you can't go on a treadmill and run for 10 hours and lose 50 pounds, you can't go pour a bunch of water in a plant and it grows overnight. It's the same thing with relationships and trust. You slowly grow that over time. And that is really what I think the mindset shift is, that it's not about fast sales and sending these emails and getting this return. I think that works for a lot of companies at a certain level and stage. But this goes back to growth levels and expectations. As you start to grow and you start to work with clients and the stakes get higher, you said it before, these jobs don't exist often, right? These budgets exist a few times a year. And when we talk about how the industry is shifting later, it's being chopped up and segmented in ways that completely different. And so we have to accept that it takes time to build these relationships. But if you go through the process, if you are curious, if you understand what actually matters to them, like, we do this 3-step process where we define what our business is. We sort of build our engine and our fuel where 80% of our work, our core clients, like we got to protect that core. We got to make sure that they are taken care of. But there's that great book, Future Shock, which sort of states that the only constant is change, right? So that we know you need that 20% of growth of like, okay, where are these needs going? Or where do we need to go next to make sure that we are staying relevant? Because I think a lot of us are doing work that if we put it on a graph, we would see those budgets go like this. And I think a lot of people are in this like, oh shit zone, right? They're in this place of there's still work, but is that work going to exist in 5 years? And so everyone needs to build this engine and fuel, right? You don't only do business development when times are bad, and you don't. You go to the gym every single day. You put in the work. And it's relationships. It's just like being a good human. It's being curious. It's providing value, but it's doing it in a way that matters to your clients, not what matters to us, right? A lot of times our clients don't care about the things we think they care about.
Right. So, okay, well, let's get specific though. So Spotify is an example. Let's say your studio wants to work with Spotify. You've never worked with them. You don't know anyone at Spotify, but you know that you want to work with Spotify. So what's step one?
Step one is understanding what Spotify actually does and what they actually do. And I have this obsession of research, but everyone always says they want to work with the same 5 companies, and it's so exhausting. I have this conversation 100 times a week. And when you actually go and research and understand the type of work that they do, what we are trying to do is track demand, right? If you were to go to Spotify and look at all the different places that they do their communication, their advertising, all these different platforms, it's not rocket science, right? TV is the, typical linear is the most declining, let's say, but it's online, it's digital. And we essentially have access to all the platforms to go and see the type of communication that they do. We'll talk about this later, but I also think a lot of the work that we do is not going to be traditional like marketing or advertising the way that we might think of it, of like, explainer films or product marketing or things like that. But the first step is to say, like, does this brand actually need what we create? Because if you look at Spotify and you're like, wow, we're like a CG hardware render company, I might look at Spotify and say, I don't know, where's the work? I don't see it, right? And so you always want to make sure that there's nothing worse than going into a capabilities presentation and you're like the person in Soho with the watches and you're like, hey, check out all these watches. You like these watches? It's like you're selling them something, right? That they might not even need. And that is the worst place to be in. So we have to understand what our clients actually need. I think from there, we can start to identify who those decision makers are. I think what is special about our industry is that if you're a consumer brand, you have to advertise to lots of people to get them to buy your products. Most of these brands, the decision makers, it's one or two people. Like we can really understand who they are, what matters to them. And again, that goes back to what is their real job to be done and what is actually the reason how they make decisions. From there, we kind of go through this process where I don't think sending a cold email is ever going to change someone's mind at this level, right? A random one-off message is just not going to be like, oh, this person has solved all my problems. Thank goodness I got this cold email. My life has changed. Head of creative at Spotify, like just never going to happen. And so what we do is we actually develop campaigns for creative companies, which is like kind of a weird concept, I think, for people to wrap their heads around. But it's this idea of like, no, you have to get people excited, right? You have to address what their needs are, what those pain points are, because to create behavior change, like you have to really, it's a compelling, hard thing to do. And so we go through this process of developing campaigns, understanding where people exist, but also where they exist in their journey, in their buying journey. And I'll give you one quick example. I call it the who, what, when framework. The who is Google Pixel, the what is 3D hardware renders, and the when is Google I/O, right? Google I/O is May every single year. The what is watch the event. There's a lot of 3D hardware renders. There's a lot of 2D animation. There's a ton of live action. And the who is going to be those teams at Google, right? And so what you start to understand is this idea of seasonality, timing, right? Understanding what their needs are, but also understanding when those needs exist. And so my goal for these companies is to build a map, right? Build a map where you're sort of saying, what are we doing? When are we doing it? And what is that story that we're going to tell? Because storytelling is not sales, right? It's why storytelling is so powerful, because it creates this sort of, emotionally resonant experience where a person can put themselves in that experience. And so the more that we can create these compelling stories of why we are the differentiated choice, that's when behavior change happens. And it happens, again, over time. It takes time.
Right. Now, I love the concept of a campaign aimed at, a stakeholder, a decision maker at a company like that. And I can kind of imagine different phases of that. I'm curious, like, what are some of the tactics? So obviously, I agree with you. Sending a cold email to someone is almost never going to result in, oh, you're perfect, I'll hire you right now for something. That's especially at that level. But is that how you start? You start with a cold email, and then maybe you connect with them on LinkedIn, and then maybe you just send them something nice. Hey, I saw this thing you guys did. I liked it. What are some of the things you do over time to actually start to build that relationship, gain some trust, at the same time subtly letting them know your capabilities? I know you want to hear Joe's answer, but first I want to make sure you know about our in-depth motion design curriculum at School of Motion. We don't just offer classes that you can take anytime. We also offer interactive guided sessions that go deep into teaching you how to use After Effects, Cinema 4D, how to animate, how to design, how to illustrate, and much more. You get to learn alongside other motion designers, and you even get feedback and support from your own personal teaching assistant, a professional motion designer who's part of the School of Motion community. Find out more on our site. The link is in the description. All right, back to Joe.
I'll tell the story of how this all started, and it started back at State because it was this exact same problem. We did not understand. We were young. We did not have the sort of we did not have any status. We were just freelancers. And so someone once told me, if they see you in 5 places, they think you're everywhere, and that really stuck with me. And so the process that we took early on was back when people used to work in offices, we printed a book of all of our work, right? And so we took this book, we put it in a big manila envelope, and we wrote all these creative directors' names with a big black Sharpie. And we had done research, right? Again, research is sort of the foundation of all this, of who are we targeting? Now, we were positioned very well then, right? We were just doing a lot of sports work and entertainment. So we sort of broke it up into these two different groups of people. So we sent this book out to, I can't even remember how many creative directors, but again, we knew it would end up in their office. They can't ignore that. That was
physical book.
Physical book of the work that we had done. And I can maybe jokingly say, like, we were work that you maybe wouldn't put on a website because you worked at a studio. So we sent out that book. We know that they would get it. We FedEx tracked it so we could see who opened it. 2 weeks after that, then we placed an article. It was in a sports trade and then an entertainment trade that we knew these people read, right? And so that happened 2 weeks after that book was delivered to all those creative directors. 2 weeks after that, we did kind of the classic studio newsletter launch back when that was a cool thing in 2010. And again, we segmented it. We had one newsletter that was only focused on entertainment, one that was only focused on sports. We actually A/B tested both those versions. And then 2 weeks after that, they got an email from Joe, right? My name is Joe. I'm the EP. And in those messages, right, it's really important what you say in those messages because we then would say, we just did the rebrand of the NFL draft. We know that you have this other event coming up, which is a pain point for you. Here's a link to some of that work. It's all custom to the type of work that you do and problems that you need to solve. If you want to meet, let's get together. And this worked. The response was, who the hell are you? Where did you come from? And so it sort of got me hooked on this idea of this classic funnel, right? You can't just email people. You have to sort of pull people along, story tell who you are, but what you do, the impact of what you do. And then I think it's going to, I stole this term, but it's going to raise the surface area of luck that they're going to respond, right? I always kind of think the juice is worth the squeeze in terms of really getting people to be curious because I think an easy example is, do you ever stalk something online, right? You become obsessed. People do the same thing with creative companies, right? They want to be able to be to go and dig. And I find this with myself too, where I find creative studios that I've never heard of before. And I go on their Instagram and I try to figure out who the creative directors are. I want to create that sort of excitement with the companies that I work with. So that concept was sort of the foundation for, you can't just send a cold email, but you can't just do something once, right? That's not actually how it happens. It's this concept of priming and it's this concept of time. And that's what really creates this excitement where someone really wants to engage with you.
Dude, I love this. This is really awesome. So, all right, let's talk a little bit about the research phase. You've said research a bunch of times. So obviously research the company, figure out, what big events they have every year at the same time. And if it's a sports brand, obviously the playoffs are going to be a big time for things like that. That seems pretty straightforward. You can just sort of just do basic Google stalking and figure this stuff out. But then if you're trying to research who's the stakeholder, if we stick with the Spotify example, how do you even know who the heck you should be targeting? How do you know that this, industry publication exists, to be able to run an ad in it? How do you figure out how to send them a physical thing in some way that you're pretty sure they'll actually get it? What tools are you using? Is it just LinkedIn, other things?
It's all public. It is, LinkedIn is a powerful tool for me because people, even for brands that maybe someone isn't allowed to share work, people love to talk on LinkedIn and celebrate their people and their team. And so everything, and when it comes to research, it's all based on public information, right? So I am really trying to understand, well, one, who the stakeholder is. So again, I think a lot of projects have credits lists, right? You can go find this work out there. Again, people champion their work on LinkedIn. So we've got all these tactics of how to kind of find and search and do this way to backtrack to figure out who are these teams. Now, brands change organizational structure all the time, right? I could make a relationship map and org structure, but within 3 days, it could change 6 different ways. So I don't really obsess over that from this is exactly how it works, but we can start to figure out who the decision makers are and what matters to them. And I don't want to say it's the best shot, but you can often identify if someone's got the title, global head of brand, like that's probably someone important, right? There is this shift happening where a lot of the creative work is not coming from the traditional creative director or EP title. It's coming from UX, it's coming from content, it's coming from all these other, social and performance. So we can get into that more later, but it's why you have to do the research, because you actually don't know where the work is coming. So it's why you want to go and see what is out there in the world. And then we use that to track backwards, right? If the work exists, cool. Are we able to understand who did that work on the client side? And then you can kind of jump over to LinkedIn. You can jump over to other channels on Vimeo or Behance and all these other places. And you can start to build like, oh yeah, like they were the creative director across these 3 jobs at Spotify. It all makes sense now. So you have a lot of, I have this joke where I say, keep scrolling. Cause like sometimes I'm like, I'm done researching this brand or this person. Let me just scroll for another minute. And that's when I find the aha. That's where I make a connection where I'm like, that's how we're going to make our way in.
And how much of that research is about building rapport with that person? Like, I talk a lot about how to do this as a freelancer, and I think the stakes are much lower. So, you can focus, I think, a little bit more as a freelancer on like the personality of the person you're reaching out to. If you're reaching out to the head of brand at Spotify and you're hoping that they pay you, $500,000 or more to do the end of the year Spotify recap thing they do every year, it's probably a much higher budget than that. It's going to be a different strategy, but how much are you thinking about, wow, I see that this person's got kids and I've got kids. Now we have a connection. So I'm going to make sure to just casually mention that I have a family so they like me more. Like, do you do those types of things too?
I track an insane amount of things is what I'll say. There's sort of 3 categories. The first is I do want to understand someone's personal story, who they are as a human, and not in a deceptive way, but in a way that, again, like I jokingly say, if we all met at a event at a bar and we all hung out, we probably all get along, right? Those of us who work in the creative industry. So I do want to know who people are just as humans, because again, it's most of the clients that I've had have become actual real friends. And it's why they also come back, because I don't always say yes to everything. I'm willing to say no. So I always want to understand someone's human story in a way to just like find real human connections. I think the next is then understanding their career, their work story, right? Like you could take a creative director at Meta, right? And you could have one creative, or Spotify, let's keep it Spotify. You could have a creative director at Spotify. One of them could have come from the studio world, places like Buck, places like whatever. And so they're going to think a certain way. But you could have another creative director who comes from an agency background, right? Maybe they came from RGA. Maybe they came from Wieden & Kennedy. They are going to think differently, and their needs are going to be a little different than a creative director at Spotify who worked at Pentagram and Collins and thinks more brand, right? All 3 of those people have the same title. So you can't just take a baseline demographic and say, oh, we want to target creative directors at Spotify. I'm like, no, that's not specific enough. Like, I'm sorry. Like their needs are going to change based on their backgrounds, what matters to them, what they are trying to accomplish. Now, we skipped a very large part of this process, which is like understanding the larger market level observation and what I call the underserved need or the opportunity. But it is really important that we can't just group these people together. It's why, because it is individual decision makers who are the ones who say, like, let's work with this studio, we really need to know their human story, their personal story. And then the last thing that we capture is things like, what are the events for the year? Things like, where do they exist in the world? Right? We have to reduce the amount of friction for us to be able to create that awareness, right? To put people through this form of a funnel, because people are busy, right? They're on calls all day. They work from home. They got, this level, they've got families and they're dealing with all this kind of stuff, right? They're not going to go out of their way. So if we understand sort of what I'll call the targeting information, where they exist, right? Are they a part of committees, initiatives? Do they, are they really active on LinkedIn versus Instagram, right? Where do we have to meet them to tell our story? Because we can't expect people to go out of their way and find us. Your only job as a business owner is for people to know that you exist and to buy from you when the time is right. And the only way for people to know you exist is through indirect methods. And so the more that we can be specific and say, hey, where does this person at Spotify, like, what do they care about? Where do they go? Where do they live? Now we are going to, again, raise the likelihood that we are showing up in their sort of day-to-day journey as in their jobs.
Got it. Okay. So maybe we can touch on really quickly the part that we skipped over that you just mentioned And I guess I'm curious because, if you're a small studio, let's say, where you don't have the endless capabilities of someone like Buck, right? And so the smaller you are, probably the more specialized or more specific your work is going to be. But there's some brand you really want to work with, and you've seen them do stuff that kind of looks like the stuff you do. So what is the step that we're missing? You can look at Spotify, you can, LinkedIn stalk people, and you can look at sort of the cadence of advertising they do, the types of things. What's the missing piece that you were just talking about?
It's kind of two missing pieces. One is it's not a surefire method. Like there needs to be enough pull and push for someone to make a decision to try something new, right? Breaking the habit of the present and the anxiety of the new. Those are the two forces that we're up against because people are creatures of habit. So they like to work with people they know. And when they're presented with new options, it's scary because they don't know what's going to happen to them. And again, a creative director's, ask could be on the line if a project goes poorly. I always start with what I call the sort of market observation, right? And this idea that like there is a underserved need, there's an opportunity to go after because you can't just say, oh, I want to work with Nike. Oh, I want to work with Google. Or, hey, we want to get into more food and beverage. Like, I don't know what that means. Like, who are you serving? What problem are you solving? Who are you going after, right? You have to target specific people who work in specific departments, who are responsible for specific products and services, who have a specific consumer that they're trying to market to, they need to tell them a specific story. And when you actually start to understand, I say it's need, not niche. I have a little bit of this beef with niche down because it's not just about, hey, I want to work with this specific group of people. No, what do they actually need, right? Like what actually matters to them? And so when you're able to say, what is the market level observation where, again, we feel like we can come in and solve this problem or bring it to life, or we see future demand growing. So that's kind of like the top level of the brand. And then you take it a level down and you say, okay, well, what's the insight, right, for this person? And that's everything that we've been talking about, right? Like what matters to them? How do they actually make decisions? Because we kind of know what problem we could solve. We now know what matters to the individual decision maker. And then the point from there is how we position ourselves, right? How do we tell the story of why we as a company would be the choice of one? I think positioning is another one of these hard pills to swallow. Like everyone's work is really good. There's a lot more studios that exist now. And it's not just a supply thing. But I think a lot of us are struggling to differentiate ourselves because we don't want to turn off this creative opportunity. We don't want to say no to this, but is making that decision harder for that person, right? It is going to make them say, well, why am I going to change what I do with this person to try someone new who does all these different things? Like, why are you the choice? And that's the importance of positioning, right? How do you create yourself as the choice of one? And then from there, that goes back to the research of like, okay, well, we understand where we think we can show up. We know what matters to this person. We've got this great compelling story of why we think we are so uniquely positioned to solve this specific problem. And again, the problem is not creativity. It's not the functional need. It's other things. And then from there, we identify where they exist in the world, right? Those touch points. And we go tell our story. And this is the repeatable muscle, right? This is the engine, right? You never turn this off. You don't just turn this on when times are slow. It's the idea that you're always kind of, this is that 20%. You're like, Roger Martin has a great quote in his book, Playing to Win, which is, I'll butcher it now live, but the point of strategy is not to achieve perfection. It's to shorten your odds, right? Like I am never going to come up with a dream strategy working with a company in 1 month, but it's become obsessed with the system that gets you to your goals, not just the goals. And that's what we're trying to build, right? The process, the muscle to say like, hey, we went after all this AR work for 3 to 4 months. But what we realized was that the budgets were awful. The margins were crap. And people need permission to let go, I think, of growth areas. People get very emotional about business. And as much as we need a process and a structure to move into new areas, we also need to allow ourselves to say, this didn't work and that's okay. We can put it aside, right? Let's keep moving forward. And that's what I want people to get, right? A way to sort of assess new markets, but you're going to hear just as many no's as you hear yeses.
I feel like we could talk about this for like days and days and days. Hopefully, by the way, if you're listening to this, if you're watching this, you can hire Joe to help you do this with your studio. So I highly recommend that. I wanted to ask you about the positioning piece that you were just talking about. Because I think that's a struggle for freelancers for sure. It's a struggle for studios that, even well-funded ones, because, I think like when you and I were kind of getting into this in the early 2000s, there weren't 1,000 studios all doing, really, really good work. And now there probably are, and there's a lot of talent out there. So what's an example of how someone could differentiate? Like what's like an example positioning that might work for a studio, say, going after Spotify? Like why would Spotify pick them versus this studio whose work is just as good,
I think it is a mixture of these different, again, not to just keep bringing up these terms, job to be done, you need barriers, triggers. It's no matter what, we always have to solve the functional need of something, right? Like I need a company to do 3D animation. I need a company to do 2D animation. If you want to go after Spotify and you don't provide that service, like you're just never going to be the choice. But this goes a little bit to this idea of generalism versus specialism, which is I don't know if this bleeds into this topic, but this is like, I think the biggest challenge because brands' needs have evolved, right? And I think for a lot of us, we've tried to find this balance of like, we could do it all. We could do your 2D character. We can do your motion graphics. We can do your 3D. And back in the day, that was great, right? In-house teams were not as robust as they are now, and they did not have the inherent knowledge that exists. This goes back to like the market level observation in terms of positioning. Like there is I can never give a blanket positioning sort of recommendation, but it's the sort of new normal is that in-house teams are smarter than ever. They know exactly what they need. But also their customers are in more places than ever before, right? You should actually follow the media to understand where new business opportunities are, because it's this idea of how are brands spending their money. And so I think for a lot of, I'll say larger creative companies or even agencies, although we won't really talk about agencies, if you're Spotify, and you want someone to sign up for your service, they are tracking you across this entire omni-channel customer journey, right? That is really hard when you split that up across a bunch of different little teams and groups, right? Yeah. You need to be able to be really robust in your both technical and your creative. And so for certain people or for certain teams, that is a whole skill set, and that is a whole sort of service and offering that a lot of us maybe don't provide. I think for other brands that are a lot smaller, a lot of these let's call them post-startup DTC brands that are now kind of entering this mid-market world where they're getting bought up by the Pepsis. They also have a sort of different set of needs where maybe you can come in and solve certain problems. And so we have to really understand what are the actual needs of these clients? Who do they have in-house? And it's why we look so specifically at every company and every sort of individual, because again, using that sort of creative director example, they might not need everything you present to them, but they might need a specialized person to come in and solve these little one-off problems versus other companies. And I gave this story earlier today to someone, you may say, man, it'd be so cool to work with Skittles. It'd be so cool to work with, some of these Cheerios, whatever. Yeah. They're owned by large companies, right? Who they're just part of a snacks portfolio, 50 different, snack companies. And there is no creative team. There is no marketing team, right? And so you have to look individually and say, what matters to these people and how do I become the choice of one? And so it's hard for me to look at, here's an easy example. It's hard for me to look at all these French character animation studios or companies that just do a very specific need, right? They obsess over it's the only thing they do. That is their focus. If I'm a creative director at Spotify and I know exactly what I need because I'm smart, I've worked at studios before. Why are you going to choose someone else over the studio that only obsessively does that one thing, right? Mm-hmm. That is a hard barrier to break because you're always going to want to go to the person that does that. And so, but the flip side is the larger company example, right? Where they need to have someone to come in and help solve larger, bigger, more global communication challenges. And so it is really understanding who is your, I hate to use these terms, ideal customer, right? Who's the customer who actually cares, and hyper focus on that. Really understand what matters to them and speak to that need. Because I bet you that person doesn't need 2D character animation and motion graphics and 3D renders. And we do a little bit of live action inside. And hey, we kind of do some strategy and some photography as well. It's too much,
Yeah.
Anxiety of the new. There's too many choices. So be clear and specific in who you serve and what problem you solve. And it is going to clarify for them why they choose you. Most studios can't define it. If you can't define it for yourself, your client is never going to be able to define it as well.
Yeah, that's great. That's really great. All right, well, let's get into the way that these things are changing. And, the big elephant in the room is the economy. So, I recently made a LinkedIn post asking people, what's the biggest story of 2023? And it was almost unanimous that it was either the economy or it was AI, and it was mostly the economy. I think, I've heard a lot of different theories really about like what happened. I mean, the result that we're seeing is work has been slow almost universally, not actually universally. There are people who are still very busy. But it seems like most people experience some kind of slowdown, and in some cases it's been really drastic, and there's been layoffs and things like that. So from your perspective, what do you think happened? Like what actually caused this?
I think the people who experienced the slowdown were just over leveraged in tech, because there are a lot of companies who've had up years and have had great years. There are macroeconomic things that happened that are the sole reason. This was an awful year for everyone. I say don't take it personally for like, what did we do wrong? Right? There's a big seismic shift. And it is why I obsess over this idea of like your portfolio of your studio, your clients, like think of it as like a stock portfolio or a 401k, right? You wouldn't put all your stock in tech, right? Because most of the companies we work with are public. And public companies are held to this ridiculous cyclical financial cycle where they have to show growth constantly. And so one goes down, often the entire sector goes down. And if all your clients are tech, that's not a great place to be. And so I think a lot of us have been very busy in two sectors, entertainment and tech. That is where a lot of the work has come from. I think obviously when inflation, right, like 2020 to 2022 are almost like useless years for me in terms of data. I don't think the data it was a bull market. Rates were so low. They were just spending the money while it was basically free. And I don't look at any of that data of like, how do we get back to that? I think 2018, 2019 is a better place to look at what's a normal amount of revenue. I also think we forget what 2018 and 2019 were like, because there was already like a shift happening to social, to digital, that 2020 to 2022, scary first few months, but it was generally a boom for most of us because live action, post-production, it just absolutely ballooned. So I think what happened is that rates went up. Everyone did overhire, studios as well, and everyone had to normalize. Everyone basically had to get their EBITDA under control to make their investors happy. And the thing that sucks is a very easy way to do that through math is by expenses, right? By dropping expenses, employees, by layoffs, you're able to reduce your costs. You're able to normalize your overall margins. And now your investors are happy because EBITDA and profitability is better. And so I think for a lot of us, we did a lot of work. Things got really, like, I don't know if we actually, if things have dried up versus just kind of are starting to go back to normal a little bit now, right? January to June, throw it out. It was a mess.
Yeah.
Budgets were basically on hold. Like layoffs happened. All budgets were on hold. They're honestly still resetting now. It's not totally over yet. And I think until interest rates totally normalize, there is going to be a general tightening, right? Like brands they are focused on more specific short-term campaigns. So they're still doing work, but it's just not as elaborate. And again, the needs are shifting for our customers. So I kind of say, who is eating our lunch is not who we always expect it is. Because the way brands are selling to their consumers, it's all distribution, right? I think for a lot of us, we made passive 30-second content, 15-second content for years. But people buy on TikTok now, right? People exist in like a small phone, and this idea of just a passive piece of video content is changing. And so it's a mixture of all these different things of the market of a inflated growth that was not actually sustainable or realistic. And because we have larger segmentation, because we have more platforms than ever, we have more competition than ever, that's why we're in this situation, right? Because there's just so many different little facets of consumers to talk to that's where brands are yes, spend has gone down, but they're chopping it up more and more and more.
I agree with you totally. I think my gut is that, and it's funny because this is like not the normal type of thing that we talk about on this podcast, but like the fact that interest rates were so low for so long really enabled like the VC world to throw billions and billions and billions of dollars at tech companies who then were incentivized to spend it to grow, because and grow for a lot of these companies doesn't necessarily mean actually make more profit, especially startups. And so those days, as far as I can tell, are over, possibly for, those of us watching this the rest of our lives. I'm not sure that we will ever have 0% interest rate policy like that.
Unfortunately, that's probably
right. So how does that affect the way you look ahead? Because I think, a lot of studios and a lot of artists benefited greatly from this essentially free money sloshing around in the economy. And it's even hard to know when that started, because it was definitely before the COVID years. Like that was still, the interest rates were trending down for a long time. And now they're trending up, and we don't know like how high they're going to get in those sorts of things. So there's just less investable money for those companies. So, you're trying to read the tea leaves looking out. Okay, well, the opportunity was in tech because of the VC model, and like you had all this money that needed to go somewhere. Where's the opportunity now that you see with that drying up?
It's why we do research, but I who is getting that work and how this is all shifting? Like, again, digital spend has dropped, but think about where most consumers buy now, right? I think who is probably eating our lunch are like kind of two groups of people. One is creators, just to be totally honest, right? Like we look at social e-commerce shopping, we see where people actually buy products, right? Global brands have this omni-channel challenge where they need to track and advertise and market to everyone on a very global way, where they can literally follow you around the world. And then you have these mid-market brands that were born of social, right? And so they do more UGC, they do more creator content because it connects. And again, they're selling on platform. Distribution matters, right? Where people purchase matters. People are not purchasing on their TVs anymore. And even digital spend on like classic digital ads is evolving. It's evolving in the sense that there are just more platforms and channels. So I think group one is a little bit of like creators are starting to eat a lot of lunch because they're going to see lower cost, higher value return for a Spotify, maybe if they want to engage with a certain type of audience. I think then on the lower end, the other groups of people, and this is not a bad thing either, but used to jokingly say that, kid in Bushwick with laptop is the other person eating all of our lunch, right? We have this democratization of technology, which I think is a good thing, but there is this, I don't think it's all supply, but there is this scary race to the bottom in terms of commoditization of prices, and why I think positioning is so important. Because there are just a lot of people out there offering the same thing at a really good quality, and these prices are getting lower and lower and lower. And so at the top, you got these big global brands who have these unique challenges where maybe they need a larger company like a Buck to come in and solve really big, creative executions. You've got these mid-level, DTC, born of social, e-commerce. To be honest, I almost want to say the kids running these brands, like they're media strategists. I would say they know more than most of us creators in terms of like segmentation and audiences and things that we kind of never thought about in our world because we were creatives. And the very bottom is startups. And startups, they have to find product market fit. They are not investing into brand right now. They need to make sure they have a good product. They have revenue. They don't care about spending $100,000 on an explainer film. They don't go pay attention to product people. They think brand is dumb, And so it's like, who do you work with, right? Like it's why positioning is so important. It's why understanding who you serve, but also like how motion is adapting to the world is evolving, right? So we consume content on devices. That could be a phone. That could be internet connected TV. I still think this idea of unique design, unique motion, animation, it's not going anywhere. It exists. It is still a very important need. But where it's going, right, those channels and how it's being implemented or even who you're working with, that's what is changing.
Interesting. So I have an 8-year-old son. I got 2 girls, but my 8-year-old son is obsessed with Mr. Beast, who is the most, I think, famous creator out there right now. And that word creator, it's funny because like when I hear it, it makes me think of like a YouTuber making tutorials or, or talking about whatever, vlogging. Mr. Beast he's a full-blown production company spending $2 to $3 million per video. I've heard it said that he's worth $1 billion on paper, right? So are those now new opportunities for, and even this term motion design, it's kind of hard to even pin down what it means anymore. But do you see a world where, studios, like Buck, they're working with creators, the Logan Pauls, the Mr. Beasts, people like that who have absolutely insane distribution, and maybe their public persona and the way they portray themselves is, hey, I'm just a person on YouTube, but really there's 200 people behind the scenes working, at a full-blown corporation. Are those the type of things that you think are going to be opportunities, or are you thinking that that's going to actually be done a different way?
I think there's sort of two levels. Like the Mr. Beasts of the world are, I would put Mr. Beast on the same level as what we're seeing happen with like a Messi and Apple, right? Like Apple realized that how do you get the attention? The metrics used to be all about like, oh, it's about likes and clicks. Okay, no. Then it's about engagement. All right, now it's about attention. Right? Attention is the new metric because it keeps people on screen, and the more you keep on the screen, the more you can convert. And so what Apple masterfully did this past year was, they cut a deal with Messi to get some sort of percentage to come to Inter Miami, and it was all based on, them getting those broadcasting rights, right? So they attached a person, a human, because people don't really, Apple is not a great example because it's such an affinity brand, but like we like to buy from people and not from soulless corporate brands, which is why creators have so much success, right? They're in our ear for 4 hours. We're listening. We've got this trust because they feel like a friend in the room. And honestly, when they start to sell you something, you hear a little pitch change and you're like, oh, that's a little different. That's interesting. Yeah. And so I look at a Mr. Beast and I look at a Messi, and you could even put like what some of these other, Wrexham, Ryan Reynolds, and another example of people who have trust in their own human audience to bring together with brands and these other events to create new marketing and advertising opportunities. I think on the lower level, though, for a lot of the brands that we would see as slam dunks, it's like, oh, this DTC brand who's now like $100 million in funding and they're selling nationwide. They are finding better ROI with a different level of creators, right? Because they could say, oh, well, we want to market to people who love fashion and we want to hit this segment over here. And they're like, well, how do we show up authentically to those people, right? The day of, we used to watch just 3 channels, right? TV, radio, print. That's all it was. And so you had to have this really explosive creative to capture the attention to get people to sort of, again, create that first touch point of awareness. But now we just say, I kind of think it's why we see this declining creativity on what I'll call the above the line level, like what we see on mass market TV. But they just say, no, like, well, we just want to, market our product to people who listen to Spotify but are obsessed with fashion. So we're going to work with a fashion creator who already has this built trust, and it's going to be a lot more affordable for them to communicate, right? That media budget used to go to you to create a cool explainer film about this cool thing, right? But now they're like, no, how do we actually create value for this specific group? You have to follow the media. And I don't always mean media spend in a traditional sense of like Kantar media, where is that money going? But like where they're putting their energy in terms of their marketing and advertising, right? That's why we do the research, right? If you go to TikTok and you see, wow, they're just like going crazy there, but on other channels, they don't do any marketing or advertising. Well, they might not have work for you, and that's the more that you can understand that, the more they're going to be like, oh, you're not just selling to me. Like you actually understand my brand. You understand how we communicate, who we communicate with, and what matters to us.
Yeah. So there's a good friend of mine runs a studio in Boston. They're called Newfangled Studios. And they've kind of figured out over the years how to make content, and they do production, they do editorial, they do motion design. And they've kind of figured out how to make really good videos that perform well on social media. That's kind of their positioning, right? And I've seen decks that they've produced for some of their clients who've asked them to sort of train their internal teams too. Like, how do you, if you know it's going to be on TikTok, how do you format it? How do you structure it so that it will play well on TikTok? Because it's totally different than YouTube, totally different than Instagram. and absolutely totally different than just a traditional ad that would run on TV.
Exactly.
So the technical skills, the creative skills are still more or less the same, but it's more about like the lens they're looking at it through. Is that kind of what you're talking about? When you say like you need to look at the media, you need to look at where the dollars are going and adapt. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, a little. I'm love Michaela, good friends. Newfangled's awesome. They are continuing to be an incredible studio who's innovating and adapting to the needs of our clients. So shout out to Newfangled. I think an easy example is a lot of us and a lot of the listeners, we are motion folk, right? We grew up in motion graphics and it's what we love. And it's who I am as well. Like I'm a OG Mograph kid at heart still. But we would always say it's like, we obsess over that ease in, ease out. We obsess over these little things that I think the scariest thing for a lot of us is, does that actually matter to our clients, right? Do they actually care? Is the ROI there to spend the investment into that? Now, this is why positioning is so important. And I'll give kind of an example. If you're someone who every single little movement, every single, the way something feels is so important, you're freaking out because your former clients don't have those needs anymore. There's probably AI that does 2D character rigging better than you can. And like, how do I make my money? But this goes back to the adapting, changing needs. So when you think about your phone, wherever mine is, right? Like inside of this phone, there are lots of little animations, moments, motion, right? I think this goes back to my new theory of UX 2.0, which is we used to think about how motion and animation exists inside of devices as simply product design, like product motion. But I will tell you this, there are brands out there who do, and I'm making this up, I don't know this for real, but it's like, when I think about Apple, right? And I think about, they just did the update on the watch, and there's some really great little interactions and moments on the watch. They care about every keyframe, for sure, right? This idea of like human interface and how motion interacts with people throughout different experiences and touch points. Like there are folks out there who say, no, this is something that is real. This has to move a certain way. So your skill and the thing that you're obsessed with, the client might not exist anymore, but it doesn't mean that you all of a sudden don't have, again, that ICP, that customer who cares, the one that actually says, no, I need someone who is so obsessed over every movement. That value is right for me. And so we have to think outside, we have to sort of remove ourselves from this narrow traditional way of thinking of what motion means, of what animation means, right? Characters and world building can still happen, but it can happen in product. I think Duolingo and the Gunner story and all that stuff is a great example where I see world building, I see characters, I see storytelling. What a fun journey it is to watch Duo have these adventures and be this hilarious, mascot, but it's in product, right? And they're using different tools and they're approaching a different way, but it's still character animation. It's still storytelling and it's still world building. So that goes back to the market level observation, right? Like motion is changing. It's evolving based on the platform in which it is displayed. Who are the folks who are willing to embrace it, and who are those who don't have those needs anymore?
Right. Okay. So I want to dive into that in a minute, but I want to stick on this topic of the changing sort of advertising landscape, because advertising has been traditionally where you make money as a motion designer, as a studio. And, over the last, I don't know, probably 10, 15 years maybe, product has started to overtake that, right? And I think, Apple's the perfect example, Google, Facebook, all of those companies. The budget for product animation is probably a lot higher than marketing animation, right? But then at the same time, there's these weird things I'm starting to notice. Streaming platforms, since they've existed, basically, the promise has been it's all of the good things about TV shows. You get shows you like to watch. You get Stranger Things. You pay this low fee. There's no commercials. This is wonderful. Watch it whenever you want. And now there's, rumors that Netflix is actually going to start introducing advertising into their model. Hulu's been doing that. I assume Amazon and maybe even Disney Plus will eventually follow suit. And I'm guessing here, but I'm guessing some of that has to do with the fact that they can't just raise money and their stock price is down, and they actually have to generate a profit with these things, which some of them haven't actually been doing. So, is there a chance though that like that market force, it brings back the 30-second spot and all of a sudden we're doing that kind of stuff again? And like, do you think there's a chance that kind of makes a little bit of a return?
I do have a theory that we're entering this sort of post-advertising world where content connects with consumers more than marketing and advertising. And I think there are a number of brands who have embraced this idea of not having an internal creative marketing team, but having an internal content team. And there's a very big difference between an internal agency, an internal creative studio, and an internal content team. They are all serving three very different purposes. And I think they're looking at the creator economy to say, kind of that example before of 4 hours in your ears where you feel like you've built this relationship with someone. It's, I always give these two examples, but was it Nissan and Acura? One of them is in brand trackers. Well, I don't know. Brand trackers at XYZ. Go subscribe.
Yeah, there we
go. They did this great campaign for one of their cars, and it was kind of a play off of Lo-Fi Girl, which is a really popular YouTube channel with like this deep mix stuff. And what they did was they just made a really awesome 4-hour mix, and they worked with I think they worked with like Titmouse or The Line. Someone can correct me in the comments to do this like awesome 4-hour like animation of this person driving through like the countryside. And the mix is awesome. Like I listen to it when I work. And when you read the YouTube comments, what do you see? It's like a bunch of people being like, I love this mix. This is amazing. Wow. I love this. Like this is how advertising should be. Like you're providing in the same way I talk about providing value to our clients and helping them make progress to whoever their target consumer, which is clearly like a Gen Z, born online type of consumer, like that's what they want. They want a 4-hour lo-fi girl mix to sit there when they do their gaming to kind of jam out to. And there's sort of this 4-hour ad embedded, which could you imagine how much money a 4-hour ad would cost in any other way?
Right.
Go Google it. If you're watching this, go Google that ad. And so Acura did something similar where they were promoting one of their new cars and they made this. There were like 4 1-minute spots. I think The Line actually did this one and Titmouse did the other one, where it was like, I forgot, it was like someone's journey. And it was like this great anime. And it was like, again, just content. Of course, it's the cars in Acura or whatever the brand was. But people like loved it. The comments were all thrilled. That's character animation. That's storytelling, right? We're not losing the things that we all love, but how it's being distributed, what brands are taking those, I don't want to say those chances, but they see the value, right? If you can say those two brands, like they understand the value of this type of storytelling and content. So don't go after a linear network who has no budget, who can't create any of this content, but there are other people who are your customers who matter, who actually care. And that's how you're going to find the next 10 years of work.
I love it. So let's pivot now into sort of the product side of things, because I do think there's a ton of opportunity there. Obviously, there's been opportunity there for years now, but I mean, I feel like with the sort of waning advertising budgets, at least temporarily, hopefully they do start to come back. And, I think that's always going to be a pretty large component of what motion designers are working on. But now, and part of this I think has to do with like just how good the tools have gotten. You've got a tool like Rive. I'm actually speaking with the founder, Grudo Rosso, of Rive in about a half hour. So I'm gonna definitely tell him we talked about his product. But they make it so much easier for animators to create things that can then be interactive, and they make it easier for developers to implement those things. And Duolingo is the perfect example because they're using Rive. They literally bought Gunner, one of my favorite animation studios based out of Detroit, I assume largely in part because they were really good at character animation. They were always on the cutting edge. They've got a partner studio called Hobbs that does like drone animation and stuff. And, they're using Rive to create these interactive characters with lip sync and all these cool things. And that's a totally different use case. It's also a different budget. And it's probably a different way of working, different expectations, different timelines. If you were giving advice to, studios listening to this or artists, how can you start to get some of that, get some of that work?
I can't wait to hear your conversation with him. Please call me Guido. I'd love to talk to you. I think this is the future. I think for us, for a long time, we've delivered JSON, we've been delivering Lottie, right? Slowly over time, but they all kind of have their own technical challenges of like color sampling and frame rates, and it's kind of a pain in the ass, and it never really got somewhere. I think that's why Rive is really exciting, and we see Duolingo, we know Figma uses Rive a lot. There's a great little case study on the Figma blog about it from a few months ago. And it goes back to like what I think is UX 2.0, right? I think for a long time, websites were websites, right? They were information content structured a certain way. And same thing with product, right? It was boxes you pushed and text appeared and whatever. But this, how motion interacts with the consumer, right? It's evolving. Right now on a website, you have not just a wipe or a transition. You might have a little animation that plays to reveal a piece of information. They call them sometimes spot animations, spot illustrations that exist on web experiences. Same thing within product, right? With what Rive is doing, which is it's no longer just about product person who's thinking about how to move someone through this like user flow, user journey. They want to think about creating these little moments, these little experiences inside the app that make it feel special. And this is no hate to our UX friends who do that, but they don't have the same motion skills that a lot of us who grew up in motion graphics do. So I think it's why you see a lot of what I would call like very talented designers and motion artists moving from studios to brands, but really working with product teams because they want to bring that same level of craft and care. And again, that ease in, that little movement, like it matters so much to when you can feel an animation, right? When you can taste an animation, right? That's like, that is that little thing for us. That's like, wow, that's why you love Apple, right? It's why you love some of these brands because they give that little bit of extra care that just makes them a little bit different. And so you have to pay attention. You have to track this stuff. You have to see where those needs are going. And so I think the Rive is a great example. I don't even think we were we're just getting started. Like, I don't even know if we've started yet. Where this will look like in 5 to 10 years with like animation on websites, on products. And I don't want to limit it either. We don't have to go down this path, but like retail, in real life experiences, Netflix with all these activations that they're launching. There's just opportunity everywhere for us to bring motion, and not to dumb it down to this, but it's just the device, the platform, the channel, the touch point, right? Where is that coming to life? And that's what we need to start to figure out, right? We look at these brands and we say, hey, Netflix doesn't do commercials. Have you ever seen a Netflix commercial in your entire life? No, you haven't, right? Like they do it through different ways, right? And so motion is not dead, but where it is going is what's changing.
Yeah, I don't know if you probably have seen the probably a week or two ago, Webflow relaunched with a new brand, and they've got this new website, and it's awesome. And at the top of their website is, I assume, a spline element. So spline, if you're listening, you don't know, that's one of the new sort of cloud-based 3D modeling animation software that's come out recently, but it's designed for doing these sort of interactive things. And so you can make your 3D elements, you can animate them, but you can have it be responsive to the size of the browser, and you can have hover states and click states and all this. And on the Webflow site, as of this recording, they have this absolutely phenomenal piece of artwork that reacts, and you can click it and you can play with it, and then you keep scrolling down, something else happens. And it's funny because all of that is motion design to me. Yeah. And I'm really excited to talk to Guido because a lot of the challenge for motion designers is understanding and having to learn now. I know how to animate those things, but I don't necessarily know how to create it so that the software engineer can then play with it and do what they need to do, right? There's some new skills I think motion designers need to develop. And I also don't see studios, I'm sure they're out there, but it's hard to find. There's not studios that are like specializing in that yet. Or maybe, I don't know, let me ask you, like, do you think that there are, or like they're just not being very loud about it? To me, that seems like a huge opportunity, doing stuff like that.
I think it's going to happen very soon. I think it's a need. I think it's happening in-house, and the in-house demand of it is just bubbling up to the point where it's going to start spilling over to studios and artists. Yeah. I just think it's not about the technology, right? But we have to adapt to the evolving platforms and the evolving technology. And you said it, it's like working with product is different, right? As I talk to my friends at brands who work directly with product, they also need to adapt the way they speak, right? Because they think in sprints, they think in PRDs, they think in a sort of a whole different way of approaching. So our normal assumed stakeholder, we're like creative director at brand or agencies who our client is. It's like, no, now it's like product engineer who and UX person who needs to really help put you down this pathway. And so while we haven't seen specialization in it, and you're about to have that conversation, but I'm going to hold my guesses, but I think they have a playbook that I assume is going to work out well.
All right. So let's talk about the specialization versus being a generalist thing, because, there was a time, and I think, if you're still at the top of the mountain of Houdini artists in Los Angeles, you probably are going to have a great career for the rest of your career. Just doing
Houdini
that,
artists
right?
will be fine. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly, right? But, I can imagine that if you're a motion designer that pretty good at design, got some animation chops, you also taught yourself Figma, and you've learned a little bit about like UX principles, the way design gets kind of applied there. You maybe can do a little bit of Framer. Like you're not like a full-blown web developer, but you can move around Framer and you can integrate Rive things and create like really beautiful interactive buttons and transitions. And then you can hand that off to like real full-blown full stack engineers. That's a type of generalist that I haven't met very many people like that. I think that might be, the generalist to me used to mean you can do 2D, you can do 3D, you can design and animate, right? And maybe you can do a little video editing too. Then you're kind of a unicorn. Now I wonder if it's going to be, sort of this overlap of the worlds of UX and motion, which, I mean, they've always overlapped, but they still have always felt very separate to me. And now they're not feeling so separate. And Rive, I think, is kind of the prime example of that. So I'm curious, maybe you could talk about like your philosophy on specializing right now versus being a generalist, pros and cons of both.
I think that example is great. We could just use that as an example because I always say it's we said this earlier, but it's learning a new language, right? I think a lot of us OGs never learned marketing. We never learned brand. We never we were creatives and we delivered creative and that's what you got, right? And again, people hire us for expertise in craft. And knowing where we stand on the value chain is incredibly important, right? Like it's the success of a lot of the campaigns that we work on is actually not of our doing, right? A challenge starts on a business level, right? There's often a business lead or a business team that says, hey, we've noticed a decline in people going to this part of the app or subscription signs up. So we've come up with this business brief. That business brief goes to a brand, a marketing, a product team, a performance team, whatever. They then say, okay, here's our marketing brief. Great. This is what we're trying to accomplish. Okay. Hey, we got to create a creative brief, right? Then they create a creative brief and they then come to us. And so those decisions above us are often just as important, if not more important than of the success of those campaigns. And it's a little bit of like our output isn't always going to be the reason something succeeds or fails, although sometimes we want to take credit and sometimes we don't want to take credit. Yeah. Now, using your example, understanding who it is that you're working with, and again, the language that they speak, like if you're working with someone who's in product and you understand what's important to them and you can speak that, hey, we can do some Figma prototypes and see how this moves and kind of play it out. Again, you're now not just like, we're hiring you for expertise to deliver this thing. It's like, no, I actually like care about what matters to you. I understand the flow. I understand like the thinking. And so I think we have to broaden our sort of curiosity to those, I've got a whole, maybe we'll attach it to this, like I call them good questions to ask to really understand what matters, right? Like, and it's not just about like big marketing challenges, but it's like how we work, who those stakeholders are, how we present things. And then they say, wow, like you work really well with this product team because you understand how they need to be, how they need to collaborate, how they need to be spoken to, how you need to present things to them. They are not going to know the things we know about animation design. So if we just send them something and have this expectation that they have, a decade, 2 decades of knowledge, it's just ridiculous. We have to take people along for the ride as well. And so this can vary from product team to a demand generation team or a performance team or a brand team, or it's like, again, there's no one right. It's why you have to look at every company and every person individually, because a product team's needs are going to be so different than just a traditional brand team at Spotify.
Right. Yeah. And I think, just sort of like anticipating if you're delivering something, and, I've run into this where, we have web developers that work on our website, and you hand them a Lottie file, just expecting them to know exactly what to do with it, and, then you see it show up on the site and it's the wrong size, the frame rate's wrong, something like that. I think it's always valuable for motion designers to learn, and you always have to know when to stop. Like, do you really need to fully learn like full stack web development? Probably not. But do you need to maybe understand concepts like, listeners and states, and, Rive's built on this concept of a state machine. And I think just learning that, all of a sudden you become more valuable.
What's that like going Gary Ross, always be closing? I always say, always be asking questions, always be curious, right? If you do
Coffee's
that
for
on
closers.
every single project and you're curious, you're honest about what you know, you have, again, human conversations. There's not really a trick to any of this stuff, right? Like,
Yeah.
I help people understand process and frameworks and a way to think about growth. But the real, like, what it all comes down to is being a curious human who wants to help actually solve problems and a willingness to ask questions and not just take them at kind of its surface level. Like, it's that thing, the 5 whys, like ask why, then ask why again, right? People are not good with open-ended questions. And so the more that we can do that and understand what matters to them, yeah, we don't have to become experts in product or performance marketing, but then we start to understand what really matters. And again, the difference between a project and a partnership is often that line.
Got it. And so I guess to just kind of like put a bow on that topic, do you think that like being a generalist in that way where, look, your core skill is design and animation, that's what motion design is. Now you're sort of expanding the umbrella a little bit. Oh, I also understand, enough to be dangerous about the way, products are designed and the kind of considerations that you have if you're working in Figma and product animation. And I mean, I remember talking to an animator once who did a lot of Lottie Files work or Lottie work, and they were saying one of the things that never occurred to them was that you could make your scene too busy and it wouldn't play back in real time. You just don't have to think about things like that traditionally when you're rendering, right? So would you recommend, or do you have a thought about like, okay, someone right now, maybe someone who's kind of getting into this industry now, they're new, should they, specializing can be very appealing, right? If you're really into particle simulation or something, that seems fun. But as a career move, and even if you're a studio, should people be thinking a little broader? I think
you can be one or the other as long as it lines up to what your client needs are. I think people have to define who their actual client, who cares, is. And if you're a new person and a freelancer coming into the industry, if that's studios, what type of studios are you going after? What type of needs do they have? Are they more generalist or is it a more specialist studios? I think some studios out there, they also do live action and they do 2D or they just do character. And then you've got others like the Man Vs and the features where they just, their work is almost more based on, again, how you feel or
it's more
a
abstract,
feeling.
Yeah.
I think I go through this process and never thought about it for individuals before, but I call it the kind of business blocks. It's like, what is your human desire, right? As a person, right? You got into this business for some reason. So what do you want as a human? I think if you want to go make money, you can make good money in this business, but like if it's all about money, you're probably going to do something else. The next thing is your creative desire. So like we are all, again, we want to explore, right? It's why we all got into this, because there is probably this childlike curiosity of wanting to create and tell different things. But like, what is that sort of checkbox for you creatively that you have to satisfy, right? There is this thing inside of a lot of us where we're never happy with our work, and that's what continues to drive us to keep being better. Financial desire, like, does this make money, right? Whether you're a studio or individual, like, is what I'm offering actually, is that rate match up? Can I be booked enough, right? If you're someone who's just doing an incredibly like specific, small little thing where demand doesn't exist a lot, you either have to hyper focus on just those people who have that need, or maybe there isn't enough demand. Again, right? It's not even a supply versus demand thing. It's like a demand side sales thing. And then from there, you kind of say, does the market have that area as well? So you've got your human, creative, financial, and market. And I think when you look at those 4 blocks, you start to say like, yeah, this makes sense, or something is missing here. So the more that people can define that for themselves, then they can go find out who their people are. And again, be curious, but don't forget that it's always going to change. I think a lot of us got stuck in like, this is what we do, but the book, go read it, Future whatever, 1970s, everything is always going to change. And once you accept that, and it's kind of like when a client sends you a brief and it's like a ridiculous budget, ridiculous timeline with a ridiculous ask. Creatives would always be like, Joe, this is so insane. I'm like, hold on. Just accept that every brief is always going to be ridiculous. And we're just going to take this information and work backwards and present to them options that we think are reasonable and still gets them the sort of outcome they want. It's the same thing with the evolving nature of what we do. Accept the fact that what you do is going to change and evolve, and embrace But don't lose that human, right? Don't lose that creative, but just know that what you did 5 years ago is not what you do today. It's not going to be what you do 5 years from now.
Yeah, I love that because it's very practical advice, and I think especially a lot of young artists, when you haven't had as much contact yet with like the way the real industry works and the way budgets work and things like that, you can focus a little maybe too much on, well, I want to do this, and you forget that that's great, and that means you're passionate, and you should always follow that passion, but also someone may not want to pay you for that. So there's reality also.
There's a joke. I won't say who I used to make this joke with, but we used to jokingly say, if you want to make art, go to Venice Beach. We're here to do communication design. It's a business. It's a business, right? And everyone should fulfill themselves creatively, as much with their work, but outside of work as well. But like, we are being paid to do something, and just, it's not like a soulless point of view, but it's just realistic. For a lot of these companies, there's this great line in the book, Unreasonable Hospitality, which is all about 11 Park Madison, whatever that restaurant. But it kind of says like, doing right by the business is doing right by you. And that's like a tough thing to accept, but it's true. And so sometimes you have to make decisions that are right for your business, whether it be a studio or individual, because that is what is going to allow you to keep doing what you do. So find that balance in sort of the work to the passion to the love. And I think your anxieties will be more calmed.
I love that. All right. So last question, and I'm sure, with the studios you're working with, you're probably getting some version of this quite a bit. The next minimum 6 months, probably more like 12 to 18 to 24 months, I think are going to be similar to what we've just seen. Hopefully things start to pick up, but I don't think we're going to have this boom where everything is instantly easy again. No. So what advice... And I don't just mean like how to go out and find work. I mean just like as a business owner, as someone who would be running a studio listening to this, what advice would you give people to try and, at the very least survive this downturn, but hopefully be able to grow, maybe not as fast as they'd like, but be able to grow throughout it?
So the first piece of advice would be just to go have conversations with people, but don't sell them on anything, right? Like go just like again, I'm going to keep going back to this be a good human thing, but it's these sort of evolving needs and everything we're talking about. It's not through some, secret science. It's through having conversations with my friends to say like, what's going on? Like, what are you actually up against right now? Like so much has changed. And so I am a naturally curious person. And I think everyone should be a naturally curious person. Again, doesn't have to be just for studios if, working with brands, but if you're a freelancer and you work for studios, like go ask those studios, like what's going on? What do you really need support on? Where are you seeing things evolve and change? Because you can't assume, right? We can't guess what is happening. It's so dangerous. It's good to do this sort of, it's the difference between like methodology and actually putting things into practice. And so although I think we can do a lot of research and think we know what we know, I will never go into a capabilities presentation ever again and just passively talk at someone for an hour and say, here's everything that's on my website. You've seen it a million times before, right? That is so ungenuine and not really creating a conversation to understand what matters to them. What are they stuck against? What kind of progress are they trying to make? And these are these little tiny shifts in the way you think and the actions that you take that I think will, in the short term, at least you will start to understand what is happening. It's going to be different for everyone. Again, I have a handful of studios that are doing fantastic. Best year in 20 years, right? That's probably insane sounding to a lot of people, but it's because, I don't want to say solely because of this, but like those people do have a very specific customer they serve. They have great relationships with those people, and they're willing to evolve and adapt. And so go out there, be a kind, curious human. Don't just look for the next booking. Don't just look for the next job. Provide value, and I don't mean provide value in some sort of like cheesy way, but provide value in the sense of like whatever it is that they're trying to do. Always just try to make that happen. Like when I talk to people, I always just want to be a helpful human. I'm curious about what people are up against, and I expect nothing in return. I think if people expect absolutely nothing in return and you're constantly a curious, helpful person, it comes back around. It really does.
Okay, real quick. If you're not subscribed to our YouTube channel or to this podcast on whatever platform you're listening, please do so. That way, you won't miss any episodes, and we have some bangers coming up. And give this episode a like or a 5-star rating, please. It helps us spread the word, and it makes me feel very warm inside. Joe Nash, thank you so much, buddy, for bringing the goods. This was an incredibly valuable episode. And I really hope that it inspires and motivates people to try some new approaches to getting work and maybe even some new approaches to the art of motion design. It really is a brave new world these days, and even though change is scary, after this conversation, I'm actually really optimistic about what is to come for motion designers. You can find Joe at joenash.com, and you can follow his Brand Trackers newsletter at brandtrackers.xyz. Links for everything will be in the show notes at School of Motion. The link for those will be in the description. And that's it for this one. I'll see you soon.